Devin Gordon, welcome to the Bookshelf Conversation.
Thank you for having me. I really
Well,
appreciate it, Ron.
this is an excellent book. So many ways to lose, and even the cover uh, pretty much says it all. Uh, but you are not old enough to have been following the Mets for their entire existence.
No.
And one of the first questions I have is, you have been a Mets fan since you were a kid in the 80s, I believe.
Mhm.
How did you go about the difference between writing about something that's within your memory versus something you had to go and look up? What was that like?
It was, that's a good question because there's also almost this shift that happens in the book, sort of midway through, where suddenly I'm alive now and I'm an active participant in in the narration of this story. Whereas in sort of the first half of the book, I might pop up first person referencing something else or a feeling or something I'd heard. But obviously, in the sort of the telling of what happened, I'm not there. And so the research part of it, um, it's funny. And I mean, now that I'm thinking about it, the research part of it was easier in some senses, because I was coming to a lot of it cold, the stuff that was before my time. Whereas a lot of the stuff that I had already witnessed, I noticed that a lot of what I was researching, reading, and learning was almost like I was undoing or revising or fixing my memories.
Now,
Um, or,
excuse me,
or
that is a good question because
yeah.
memory has always been a fascinating topic for me. And they
Mm,
said every time you remember something, it's like a Xerox, and the Xerox gets fainter and fainter
yeah.
every time. So, did you find in obviously doing research on the later parts of the book that your memory was not quite how it is reported by other people who are, in a sense, it's like turtles all the way down. Uh, they're
Right.
they're remembering things based on what other people remember, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So did you
Yeah.
find your memories were different than what you found?
Yeah. And, some of that obviously is just mistakes of memory. It's usually not that something happened that that you made up or conjured, but there's definitely things where I thought something happened in a certain order, or maybe an event that I thought, I always took for granted happened for X reason. I've totally misrepresented or misremembered, I should say, the order of events, and I'm totally wrong about it. What happened most of the time was what I would find is I had a very naive or simplistic understanding of something that happened, right? Like I think a lot of us do. And that forms our understanding of it. And over time, it hardens into a belief, and sometimes other beliefs get piled on top of it. And what I would find, this was particularly acute on the subject of media coverage and race,
Mhm.
was that the closer you looked, the stories would change and sometimes change dramatically. Like my understanding of Dwight Gooden's rise and fall as a Met over a very short period of time is wildly different than my understanding now as a 44-year-old, reflecting back on everything that I know about purely the context of what was going on. Tampa, 80s Florida, young black celebrity, compared to what I knew then, which was just what I was reading or hearing.
Well,
um
again, in those days, you were being the fan, and you weren't privy to that kind of
yeah.
information. And it's later on as we grow and mature, and in this case, doing research for a book, that you find all these other things. I think you're in when you talk about Tampa, you're referring to when he was pulled over by cops, and they were wanted to break his arm to teach him a
Yeah.
lesson just for being who he was.
Yeah, I mean, when you're 10 years old and you're from an hour north of New York, and you're a white kid from the suburbs, and you read in the paper that he was pulled over for speeding at a very, very high rate of speed, you don't know that this is the like about the eighth or ninth or 10th time that he's been pulled over, um, and pulled over in part because they know it's him. And when you're 10 years old, all you understand or all you comprehend is, well, I don't understand why he was resisting arrest. Why wouldn't he just do what the police said? The police are good.
Mhm.
And when the police tell you to do something, you listen to them. So why would he lunge for their gun? I don't understand why he would do that. Is my favorite baseball player a bad guy? Is he a druggie? You know, and when you're 10, that's what you come away with. And it's not until you get to be researching this stuff now and you live through all the things that we live through now that you realize the Tampa Police Department had some real issues in that time. And they targeted him and they profiled him. And they pretty clearly would have killed him if they were confident they could have gotten away with it. And
As
that's
a 10-year-old, did you have anyone to go to ask
no.
these questions? Your parents weren't fans?
Parents weren't baseball fans. And, you know, I grew up, you know, like I'm saying, this is the mid 80s, you know, sort of white, ordinary middle class suburbia that is sort of maybe inquiring on a deeper level about these things, but probably not. And I'm certainly not asking those people, not least because I have a limited subset of Mets fan parents to ask. My folks split up before I became a Mets fan. And my father, they're both from the Bronx, actually. My father's technically a Yankee fan. And so, no, I took it for granted that Dwight Gooden was actually a bad guy, 21-year-old bad guy. And it didn't occur to me because I was 10 that 21 was way too young for anybody to be declaring you a bad guy, right? That was plenty. It was like, you know, grown up, 21. Oh my God. And so those are the kinds of things that you uncover and you have to undo what you may have believed. Whereas with a similar, let's use as a parallel, the Cleon Jones saga in the 70s, which is something that I only knew the barest outlines. I knew basically that Cleon Jones's ending in New York was very bad. That was about the end of it. That was about the extent of it. But I didn't, in the research, I didn't have to undo any beliefs that I might have already had about Cleon Jones. I was able to see pretty clearly, I think, what the Mets were doing to him from the beginning, and also able to see it in contrast with the way it was being written about and reported at the time. You know what I mean? I wasn't persuaded or primed or indoctrinated with how this was covered as a tribute to Gil Hodges' leadership. I came to it right away being like, well, you know, what happened, you know, these series of racist incidents that undid Cleon Jones's career in New York. I came to them, you know, with 2020 eyes, right? So it's a very different way of researching, you know.
One of the things you talk about in the book is the coverage of these events and how basically in those days, the media were white middle-aged men who bring their own prejudices, stereotypes into things, which may be their own, which may be the overarching philosophy of the outlets that they work for.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. That's you know, and there's a continuum of that stuff, right? There's the outright bigotry, the columnists who you could, and still, who some of whom still exist, who you can sort of feel it, you know, feel the animus, the racial animus sort of bleeding through into their writing, right? But on the perfectly innocent-ish opposite end of the spectrum, I think are just well-intentioned, empathetic, nonetheless, you know, white middle-class sports writers who just don't have the same experiences, who just don't come from the same places, and simply cannot, and we're not surrounded in a moment or a period when that could be pointed out to them or illuminated to them. And so those beliefs, you know, I think the sort of some of the traditions of baseball about keeping your head down, being very quiet, loyal team, don't question authority, you know, even for very liberal-minded, progressive-minded sports fans and sports writers, when it comes to baseball, sometimes we do retreat to these rather conservative notions that wind up having racialized implications that we don't even realize, right? And I think so there's a lot of that. It ran from outright bigotry to maybe just people taking things for granted that we didn't realize might have been coded in a certain way. Like I really think I might have been a victim to some of this if I had existed in that time. You know what I mean? I don't consider myself apart from that. But now that I know that it exists, it becomes a very interesting way to look at the story of someone like Cleon Jones. And you also wind up with a very different telling when you look at it that way.
Now, part of the book is this deep, heavy issues, racism, uh,
Yeah,
patrician
we
of
hit some
ownership.
serious,
But there's a lot of
we hit
fun
some
stuff in here
serious.
too. Yeah, there's a lot of fun stuff in here too. I don't want to get away from that. Uh, the early days of the Mets, their beginnings. Uh, there's a lot of funny stuff in there. There's
Yeah.
perhaps helped by the hiring of Casey Stengel as manager. Uh, whereas the American League expanded the year before, uh, the National League learned from their mistakes and they protected more good players than the National
Yes.
League did. But the Mets went with name recognition as much as they could. The Astros went with younger players, neither of
Hmm.
which expected to succeed anytime soon. But the Mets built on that, I think. Uh,
Yeah.
with none other than Marv Throneberry was a representation of those. Let's might as well have fun while we're doing this until something better comes along in a few years. Talk a little bit about Marv Throneberry for those who might not know who he is.
Mark Throneberry was a power hitter, a young power hitter for the Mets, who had some real talent as a power hitter, but came to be sort of the emblem of the '62 Mets for his combination of not insignificant ability and fundamental failure to grasp certain elements of how the game was played, specifically remembering to step on first base when you hit a double, seemed to be a real particular block. Like, this is not a joke, like he did it once or twice and everybody made fun of it and it became like a meme or the way it might now. He really did miss first base a lot. And that was sort of an emblem of who the '62 Mets were. They were a whole team of these kinds of guys. And then there was Casey Stengel, the manager, who, who, if he had not taken the job of managing the '62 Mets, would have gone down as one of the legendary successful managers of all time. He won 5 straight World Series in the 1950s with the Yankees. He managed Joe DiMaggio. He managed Mickey Mantle. But he's remembered for managing the '62 Mets. He was our first victim of our legend. And one of the things that was very interesting for me from the start about the Mets was Casey Stengel himself, because as an 8-year-old, 9-year-old, 10-year-old, I learned about Casey Stengel. Every time there was a rain delay on WWOR games, they'd show you the footage of Casey Stengel when he's doing his stand-up act. And I loved that about the Mets. I loved that, as someone who was sort of grew up on comedy and loved funny people, the fact that that was sort of the origin story of my team versus the 27 Yankees and Babe Ruth and the 4 Horsemen or whatever, like that Lou Gehrig, the Iron Horse, and today I consider myself the luckiest man on earth. No, we're Marv Throneberry and Casey Stengel, and I loved that, and it's who we were from the beginning, and I feel like it partly explains who we are today, right? It's DNA. Our DNA was being a fun, lovable, slightly comic franchise from the beginning, and I don't think it's a surprise that genetics or that genetic code is still here.
Now, the book obviously takes a chronological order, but you skip certain years,
Yeah,
because how many times can you say the same thing? For me,
yeah.
I think the low point, because I started as a fan, I would say in the mid '60s,
Mm-hmm.
uh, just before the miracle
Just before Seaver.
of
That's great.
'69. Uh, but in the later '70s, when they were bad, I had the good fortune of not being in the country while they were doing this. I was up in Canada at a sleepaway camp for 5 years, so I missed all that. So
That's great.
that was one of the really down points, as well as the early '90s. It was after the Mets were good in
Yeah,
the late '80s, but then when they started getting people like Bonilla
yeah,
and Saberhagen and Coleman and
yeah.
Murray, you had such high expectations, and they were so disappointing.
So
And
disappointing.
that's part of, I think, so many ways to lose. The way they handled their acquisitions, and I wrote at some point that their failing was in their acquisitions. They got rid of somebody like Nolan Ryan, who may or may not have developed into the star
Yep,
he was with the Nets,
yep,
but
yep.
the people they got in return, Joe Foy, Jim Fregosi, Vince Coleman. You know, this was emblematic of their
Yes.
failings, and that's a front office thing.
Yes.
To be fair.
To be fair, yeah, and you know, there's the Nolan Ryan chapter in the book, which is a short chapter, is called "Who Needs Nolan Ryan Anyway," and part of it is sort of a joke on that theory because the chapter makes that sounds like a joke in the headline, but the title of the chapter, you find out that it's sincere, right? The Mets were right to trade Nolan Ryan. The problem with the trade was what they got back.
Mhm.
And Tom Seaver has, who is very good friends with Nolan Ryan, has adamantly said the pitcher Nolan Ryan became was not going to happen in New York. And this seems pretty plausible when you look at how strong the Mets pitching was in those years. They didn't need Nolan Ryan, and Nolan Ryan wasn't getting the ball over the plate. And the sort of assumption that it's still the Mets' fault for failing to develop him. Well, they didn't fail to develop Tom Seaver. They didn't fail to develop Jerry Koosman. They didn't fail to develop Gary Gentry. And as soon as he left, they didn't fail to develop John Matlack. So the idea that this was an institutional problem with Nolan Ryan, any GM going into that offseason would have looked at their roster knowing they needed an impact bat to really have a chance to get back to the World Series, looked at their pitching staff and said, Nolan Ryan, that's the guy we trade. Every GM in baseball would have said it. And so the Mets were right to pursue that strategy. Everybody knows you have to give up talent to get talent. It's just that the Mets traded for Jim Fregosi, who was a 30-year-old shortstop when they were trying to get a powerful third baseman, who is not really a power hitter. He was more of a doubles hitter who, had some pop. And then he broke his thumb trying to adjust to third base, like right away. And that was it. It was done. But the notion of the trade being the worst or one of the worst of all time is fair insofar as you concede the truth, which is that the absence of Nolan Ryan in no way cost the Mets a World Series. He did not. Nolan Ryan is not the reason the Mets didn't win a World Series. Getting nothing for Nolan Ryan is the reason they didn't win the World Series. I think in the book I point out that at exactly the same time, Baltimore traded Frank Robinson to Los Angeles for Don Sutton. Now, Don Sutton, I think, is in the Hall of Fame, right? Don Sutton's a really good pitcher.
Yeah.
Really good pitcher. In fact, Don Sutton was almost who the Mets traded Tom Seaver for a few years later. If the Mets had gotten aging but still very dangerous Frank Robinson in exchange for Nolan Ryan, we're not having this conversation, right? There's no chapter in my book about Nolan Ryan because it's a win-win. The Angels got Nolan Ryan and he anchored their team for a decade. And Frank Robinson, God knows what he ended up doing for the Mets as a power hitter late in his career. I think for the Dodgers, he had like 30 home runs that year. Like, he was terrific. So it's complicated, but the reason why it lingers is because, as you point out, the Mets keep failing this way. We keep failing this same way, right? Like, if you keep getting burned the same way, then it becomes famous, right? And the Mets just, how many times after Nolan Ryan did we do this, right? It's just over and over and over. There were even some of these a little bit before. I mean, you probably know about Amos Otis,
Sure.
Like, the Mets probably should not have traded Amos Otis, right? Yeah. I mean, there's some domino effects that, if I have the history right, well, Tommy Agee, maybe, then it doesn't become Tommy Agee or something like that. But we did a lot of this. And we still do a lot of it. I think, most Mets fans think that Jared Kelenic is going to be the next Nolan Ryan that we traded away, right? So
one of the funny lines and the funniest lines in the book, and I'm paraphrasing, is that these days the Mets celebrate Groundhog Day by seeing who's going to be the first to get an MRI in spring training. And it's true, because you're always waiting.
Carrasco, you're the winner.
There you go. Well, one of the things I had a lot of fun doing is you mentioned certain incidents, events And I went to YouTube and I found the videos for a lot of these things. And I encourage readers of this book to do the same, especially, and I know I'm jumping way ahead. There's
Okay.
a commercial with Pete Alonso
Yeah.
for a catering hall that is absolutely hysterical. Uh,
It really is great.
that's all I'm going to say. It is available on YouTube. I'm going to link to it in the entry on the blog,
Oh,
so
that's great. That's
it'll
great.
save people the trouble. Also, there is an animated film about an historic plane ride the Mets had after
Mhm.
their championship. What was it? After the series or after the Houston?
It was on the way home from Houston after the
Houston.
NLC in 1986, and it's funny that you bring that film up. It's an animated film that if you're a
Mhm.
Mets fan, or if you're a sports fan, you just have to watch because it's incredibly well done. It's hilarious. But what's funny is I didn't know it existed until it was one of the last things that I put in the book. And then the only reason why I knew about it is because it was a co-production with this sports publication called the Victory Journal, which is a beautiful sports publication. It's like art level publication. And a friend of mine works for it. And I was talking to him about that chapter. And he's like, we did a movie on that. We did a short film on that. You've got to go watch it.
Mm.
And it actually has like reporting in it that no one had ever, that I didn't know, that no one had ever heard before. But because it was such a small kind of quirky short film, no one really heard about it. And if you really want to go in a rabbit hole, the guy who directed that film, Doc Ellis, the
Yep,
Pittsburgh
yep,
Pirates.
that's an excellent. Yep.
He did a film on that too. That is the same kind of film, an animated version of the story of Doc Ellis throwing a perfect game on LSD. That's amazing. That's the kind of baseball stuff I love. Like, building a chapter that's in many ways about sort of a homemade, crummy, low budget advertisement for a banquet hall that if you're a Mets fan who lives in New York is like music to your ears. It's just like, that's kind of the theme of the Pete Alonso chapter. But when you're thinking about what it is to be a fan, that subjective experience when it comes to sports is indistinguishable from objectivity in a way that I think is a little unusual. And I think that's one of the reasons why I felt like I had to kind of write it first person, because there is no objective experience of sports. I didn't want it to be biased. Those are subjectivity and bias are two different things. I don't think the book is biased, but it's definitely subjective.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? I don't know if that makes sense, but like to me, that was a very important distinction to strike.
In writing this book, your career, is this your first book?
Yeah.
Okay. Up until now, you've been writing magazine pieces,
Yeah.
journal pieces, and I read an interview with the problem you had adjusting to doing a book with, if you're writing this much for a magazine, you're writing this much for a book,
Yeah.
and the trouble you had containing yourself, shall we say?
Yeah. Yeah. It was, I started out at Newsweek, and at Newsweek magazine in the late 1990s when I was there, it was a magazine that was it was 2 million people a week were getting that magazine. And the cover stories were at most 2,500 words, at most. And my first writing job at Newsweek, I was writing for the front of the book. And a lot of the items were about 30 or 40 or 50 words. And it was an incredible education in writing to be able to write both efficiently and colorfully and pack as much information with as much style into 30 or 40 words as possible. Like if you can do that, you can do almost anything. The problem is when somebody says now it's time to write a book and you just rip off that guardrail, it's like a kid going to college and eating nothing but like Cocoa Krispies for 3 months, right? It's and then what happens after the 3 months? You go, oh my God, what have I done, right? And in my case, what happened was I ended up with a 180,000 word manuscript for a book that had been contracted for 75,000 words. So, and I was like, my editor, what is that okay? Is that a problem? He's like, you just wrote a 700 word book, a 700 page book. That's not okay. You can't do that. And so, the liberation was good for the first time because it was just fun to sort of stretch out your legs and be like, just write everything you think. Write everything you think. I won't do that next time, but I'll do a version of it. You know, like I do think I'll do like a more responsible version of that.
How hard was it to cut out those things that didn't make it into the book?
Surprisingly easy. And I think that that's partly because of my history in magazines. I'm very unromantic about copy, right? I've been a writer for a while. I was, you know, I only went back to writing about 2.5 years ago. I was at GQ magazine and I was a features editor there. I didn't have anything to do with the fashion or the style stuff. I did the cover stories and I worked with our writers, and I was the editor, pure features editor. And so when you do that, you get very unromantic about how this works and the process of it. And it really helped me in my writing, because I definitely think when an editor is editing something of mine and they say, I don't get this, this isn't working, I don't argue pretty much ever, unless I'm really sure they're wrong, which is usually, you know, usually not right. Because if they don't get it and it doesn't make sense, it didn't work. It's an active, this is an active communication. And that's something that I appreciate much more, having spent 10 years as an editor. And now as a writer, as a result of that, I'm just like, I see myself sort of unromantically as just, look, I just barf this stuff up. And if you don't like it, I just barf up more. That's my job. That's what I'm here to do. If you say that I don't like that barf, okay, here comes some more, you know, and that's my job. And I think it makes it so suddenly when you find yourself with a 180,000 word manuscript that can be at most 135, and you're basically thinking, I have to cut a book from my book. Yeah, it's you know, it got, the challenges were practical, let's say, not emotional. They were practical. You know, it's like, oh wait, now I have to fix this hole, or wait, do I need to get rid of this whole chapter? Because if I do, what about this? You know, like it was more strategic than emotional.
The editor you worked with, the book is published by Harper.
Yeah.
You obviously had a good rapport with your editor.
Yeah, and I also, you know, this is one of the things that you don't realize is how the editing process works. So our rapport was bumpy at first because I was a magazine editor who's used to being there and having turns arounds and going through and line editing. And he's a book editor who's getting manuscripts piling up that take him a long time to go through. And it's just a very, very different pace. And my brain is the pace of, you know, magazines for 20 years now. So once I'm like, oh, this is his rhythm, then it's fine. You know what I mean? And the other thing is, like, depending upon what kind of writer you are, like if you're, how much you need the feedback, like you may not send your editor anything for a couple of months, and then it's your own paranoia that's eating you away. But then what also happened was, you know, his editing process was he gave me a bunch of sort of macro notes. It wasn't a line edit. And at first I was a little thrown by that too. And, you know, I sent him this memo being like, here's some things I do in my writing that, you know, maybe you'll know. And he's like, yeah, we'll get to that. This is, his note was, all of your chapters are way too long. You know what I mean? Like, and like, I'm thinking, okay, you know, am I doing this too much in my writing? And he's book thinking, right? And once I sort of got onto that wavelength with him, it was much better. And then the next round, he, you know, he hired an outside editor to do what was more of a line edit. I mean, it was never going to be a line edit. And part of that I realized is, like, they paid you money up front because you already know how to write. Like, they're not expecting to have to line edit. Someone like you, at least, because if they did, they wouldn't have given you the book deal. But the guy who got hired from the outside, Mitchell Ivers, is a wonderful guy, like a veteran editor, forever and ever and ever. And now is kicking back and doing manuscripts when he feels like it. At first I was like, does this mean my book is a problem? And he's like, no, this is like, we want somebody to help you get this from like a high shine to a really high shine. And that's what he's good at. And that was another part of the process I was not used to, right? Like when you in magazines, if you're bringing in another editor to help, it's usually not a good sign, right? But in a book world, it's almost like job triage and how the process works a little bit with some things. So all of that stuff is totally, hazy to me.
It's a learning experience.
Yeah, and it's scary to go through it. But now having gone through it, I'm like, oh, okay, I get what they were all saying. I get it. When they were telling me to chill out, they were right.
When did you contract to do the book?
So this was started with an article in the New York Times Magazine about Gary, Keith, and Ron, which was late summer of 2018, August 2018. And we sort of agreed in principle on the book deal around October. But then the contract I didn't get for like another 3 months. So, which is instructive for where I am now, knowing that even if I wanted to go start writing another book or get another book deal, even if it happened like that, which it's not going to, I probably wouldn't be signing pen to paper until June, so makes you think about what your life is going to be for the spring. But what ended up happening was I started working on the book in the spring, summer of 2019, and was writing it by the fall of 2019, and then really writing it the winter of 2019, 2020, because my original pub date was August 2020.
The reason I bring that up is pandemic. How did that affect? I mean, I know it affects you because you're doing stuff like this now instead of going out on the road and talking to people. You're part of the excellent Pandemic Baseball Book Club group.
Yeah, go Pandemic Baseball Book Club.
So how did that? I mean, you had already started this. You were well into the project by the time the pandemic hit. Did that, aside from the marketing aspect of it, did that have any effect on the project?
I mean, not in terms of the final book itself in some weird way. In fact, the book is almost entirely pandemic free. It ends with pandemic foreboding, right? The pandemic is about to ruin 2020 for the Mets. PECOTA has picked us first. And of course, a global pandemic is about to stop us. But so that's kind of what the book has hanging over it as you end it, is that this is about to come. But from a practical standpoint, I finished writing the manuscript, and I live in Boston now, but most of our friends are still in New York, and had plans on driving from Boston to New York to have a dinner with friends the first week in March 2020. And so that was basically me coming out of hibernation the first week in March 2020. And as soon as I came out of hibernation, we went into lockdown, and I went right back into hibernation. And as soon as that happened, my pub date was August 2nd, I think. I can't even remember. I think it was August 2nd. And as soon as we got to realize how bad it was, you do that writer thing where you're like, no, it's going to be fine. It's going to be fine. And then even you start talking yourself into, well, and this for a long time, I really did believe. I was like, I think there's a real chance there's no baseball season. And if there's no baseball season, my book is literally the only new thing Mets fans are going to have. So why don't we put out this book? Because we are going to fill a vacuum. And of course, those are all just denial, right? And the editor and even my agent is sort of slow walking me into the reality that we need to move this book. We have to move this book. And it's so hard in that moment not to take them moving the book as a rejection or judgment of your work, right? But I was really helped because the friends who I know who've written books or writing books or new people in the industry were like, you got to understand, every writer who has a book coming out this summer wants to get their book moved. Everyone. You're the only one who's saying you want your book to stay. You're crazy.
Well, certainly for baseball books, the key dates are April, basically before the All-Star break, because you got the opening of the season, you got Father's Day. So
yes.
So in a sense, you're lucky that it was delayed because it's coming out now.
This is such a better deal. It's better in every single way, and I feel like a fool for every moment that I spent thinking, no, we really should just stay put with August. Even absent a pandemic, this is a better time. You know what I mean? Like even, just, if we were just, the reason why it was out in August was primarily because of when we had signed the deal and when I was going to turn it in. It was, okay, well now add 7 or 8 months to that. But this is better. It's much better. And, as well as I do, this next week is a huge push for the start of the season, but we are in a nadir of spring training interest right now. It is mighty, mighty dull. And if you're a journalist in a moment like this, having been a journalist in moments like this, you're desperate. You're looking for anything interesting to fill your column or your spot or your radio thing. And I am here for your desperation. That's, I'm here to fill in that void, get you through the lazy 7th inning or something like that. I don't know.
We've been talking with Devin Gordon, author of the wonderful new book, So Many Ways to Lose, The Amazing True Story of the New York Mets, the best, worst team in sports. Devin, thank you so much for talking with us. Good luck with the book and stay safe.
Thank you. This is so much fun. Thank you for having me.